For 42 years, someone watched over Margaret Cole. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his face. She didn't know he sat in a car outside her school on parent-teacher night, or stood at the back of the church the day she got married, or kept every newspaper clipping that mentioned her name in a room she had never seen. She was a teacher, a single mother, a woman who made do with what she had and never once complained about what she didn't. She thought she knew exactly who she was. She was wrong. When her foster mother died and left behind a locked drawer, a brass key, and an envelope addressed in a stranger's handwriting, Margaret's brother told her to throw it away. She didn't. Because the man who had been watching over her in silence for 42 years had just died too, and he had left her $134 million, a house she had never entered, and a locked room full of the only thing he was never able to give her while he was alive. The truth. Her brother would spend the next 3 months trying to take it all away. He would fail. But what Margaret found inside that room had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the question she had been carrying her whole life without knowing it. Who was she really? She found it in the last drawer, the one her mother had always kept, locked behind a box of Christmas cards nobody had ever sent. Margaret had been working through the house for 3 hours by then. Methodical. Room by room, the way she did everything, starting at the front door and moving back, not stopping, not sitting down, not allowing herself the kind of pause that could turn into something harder to come back from. The bedroom was the last room. She had saved it for last on purpose. Her mother's house in Hartwell, Vermont, was small enough that you could walk from the front door to the back window in 11 steps. Margaret had counted them once years ago when she was trying to explain to Daniel why they couldn't all move in together after the divorce. It's a good house, she had told him, just not a big one. He was 9 then. He had accepted that the way 9-year-olds accept things completely without follow-up questions, moving on to the next thing before she'd finished the sentence. She missed that about 9. The curtains in the bedroom still held the smell of her mother's perfume. Lily of the Valley, the same bottle on the same dresser for as long as Margaret could remember. She didn't take the bottle. She stood in front of it for a moment, then wrapped it in newspaper and placed it in the box marked Donate and kept moving. The nightstand had 3 drawers. The top 2 opened easily, reading glasses with one arm repaired with tape, a crossword puzzle book, half finished, the pen still clipped to the page she'd stopped on. A tube of hand cream, almost empty, squeezed flat from the bottom, the way her mother had always done, refusing to waste anything. Margaret placed each item in the box, kept moving. The bottom drawer didn't open. She tried it twice, thinking it was stuck, old wood, Vermont winters, the kind of swelling that happened in houses that had been standing since 1962. But it wasn't stuck. It was locked. A small keyhole she had never noticed or never thought to notice set into the face of the drawer below the handle. She knelt down and looked at it. In 42 years of coming to this house for holidays, for Sunday dinners, for the long, quiet visits after her divorce when she needed somewhere to be that wasn't her own apartment, she had never once tried that drawer. She didn't have the key. She went to the kitchen, found a flathead screwdriver in the junk drawer, where her mother had kept junk drawers for 30 years, and worked the lock for 4 minutes until it gave. Inside a shoebox. Inside the shoebox, an envelope, her name on the front. Margaret. Just that, no last name, no address. Written in handwriting she didn't recognize. The writing wasn't her mother's. She turned the envelope over. No return address. No postmark. It had never been mailed. It had been placed here in this locked drawer at some point by someone. The envelope was sealed, but the paper had gone soft with age, the kind of soft that meant years, not months. She opened it carefully. Inside, 2 things. A brass key, old the kind cut for a door rather than a padlock with no identifying marks. And a slip of paper folded once with an address printed in the same unfamiliar handwriting. A street address in Colebrook, New Hampshire. Nothing else. No name. No explanation. No please come or don't come or I'm sorry it took this long. Just an address. Margaret held the key in her palm. It was heavier than it looked. She stood there in her mother's bedroom with the smell of lily of the valley still in the curtains, and the half-finished crossword still in the donate box, and this key in her hand that she had never seen before, that her mother had apparently been keeping locked in a drawer for God knows how long, that had been written to her by someone who knew her name but hadn't signed their own. She called Richard from the kitchen. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was near his phone, which meant he wasn't showing a house. She could hear the particular quiet of his home office in the background, that slightly echoey silence of a room with hardwood floors and not enough furniture. I found something in Mom's room, she said. A locked drawer. There was an envelope inside with my name on it. There's a key and an address in New Hampshire. The silence that followed was 3 seconds longer than it should have been. She counted. She didn't mean to count. She counted anyway. Throw it away, Richard said. Mom kept all kinds of junk. You know how she was. His voice was steady, calm, reasonable. Too reasonable. Margaret had known Richard for 38 years since she was 4 years old, and he was 7, and their mother had brought her home and told him, "Wes is your sister, now treat her right." She knew the way his voice changed when he was worried about something. The way it went flat and careful, like a man choosing every word before he said it. That was the voice he was using now. The handwriting isn't hers, Margaret said. People send things, Richard said. Old neighbors. Old friends. It doesn't mean anything. You don't know whose handwriting it is? Another pause. Shorter this time, but there. No, he said. I don't. Throw it away, Margaret. You've got enough to deal with. She looked at the key in her hand. Okay, she said. She ended the call. She stood in her mother's kitchen for a moment, looking out the window at the backyard, where the garden had gone to seed. Her mother hadn't been well enough to tend it last summer, and Margaret hadn't been up enough times to do it for Huasser, and now it was too late, and that was one of the things she was not going to think about today. She put the key in her coat pocket instead of the box. She didn't know why. She just did. The office was smaller than she expected for a man who had apparently been waiting for her for 42 years. Margaret had driven the 3 hours to Colebrook without telling anyone. Not Richard, who would have asked too many questions in that careful, flat voice she was still thinking about. Not Daniel, who was in school and didn't need to spend his Tuesday worrying about something that might turn out to be nothing. She had told herself it was probably nothing the entire drive up. An old neighbor of her mother's, maybe. Someone who had known the family before Margaret was part of it, who had left something behind, who had never gotten around to collecting it. There were reasonable explanations. She had arranged them in a row in her head and looked at them for 3 hours and almost believed them. The town of Colebrook was small in the way that Vermont towns were small, except this wasn't Vermont. It was just over the border into New Hampshire, and it had the same quality of a place that had decided a long time ago it wasn't going to get any bigger and had made its peace with that. Main Street, a diner, a hardware store, and on a side street, 2 blocks off the main road, a 2-story brick building with a brass plaque by the door that read, Whitmore and Associates Attorneys at Law, the lettering worn enough that the associates had clearly been theoretical for some time. She sat in the car for a moment before she went in. The receptionist, a woman in her 60s, who looked like she had been there almost as long as the building, looked up when Margaret opened the door and said without being asked, Mr. Whitmore is expecting you. He said to send you straight back. Margaret stopped. He's expecting me. He said you'd come eventually. The woman said it without any particular weight, the way you say something you've been saying for a long time. Second door on the left. Edward Whitmore was 68 years old, with silver hair and the kind of face that had spent a lot of time outdoors relative to the amount of time his profession required. He was standing when she came in, which she noticed not sitting behind his desk, waiting, but standing at the window, and he turned when she entered with an expression that was not surprise. Not relief, either, just readiness. The look of a man who had been waiting for something difficult and had spent enough time waiting that the difficulty no longer frightened him. "Miss Cole," he said, "thank you for coming. Your receptionist said you were expecting me. I've been expecting you for some time." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please sit down." She sat. He sat. On the desk between them, he placed a thick envelope, manila legal-sized, her name typed on the front. Margaret Cole. Not handwritten this time. Typed with what looked like a manual typewriter, the letters slightly uneven. She didn't reach for it. "Your father asked me to give you this," Whitmore said when you were ready. The word landed wrong. "My father," Margaret said, "died when I was 7. A car accident. I have his death certificate." Whitmore looked at her steadily. "The man you're thinking of," he said, "wasn't your father." The room didn't change. The light through the window was the same light. The sound of a truck passing on the street outside came and went. Margaret was aware of all of it with a strange precision, the way you become precise about small things when the large thing is too large to look at directly. "I'm sorry," she said. "Can you say that again?" His name was Thomas Hale. Whitmore's voice was measured, careful, a lawyer's voice, the kind trained to deliver information without editorializing. But he had chosen to say was before he said the name she noticed. Past tense first, preparing her. He passed away 8 months ago at the age of 71. He was a businessman, construction primarily, and commercial real estate. He had been a client of this firm for 31 years. "I don't know anyone named Thomas Hale," No Whitmore said. He knew that. He let that sit for a moment. Outside, another truck. The receptionist's chair moving in the outer office. "He left an estate," Whitmore continued. "The details are in the envelope. He also left a house, a property in this county about 20 minutes from here. The house has been maintained. There's a room on the second floor." He paused. "He said the key you're carrying will open it." Margaret's hand moved before she meant it to down to her coat pocket, where the brass key sat against her palm. "He knew about the key." "He left it," Whitmore said. "With your mother. A long time ago. With instructions that it was to go to you." The water glass on the desk was full. Neither of them had touched it. "Who was he?" Margaret asked. "To me." "Who was he to me?" Whitmore was quiet for a moment, in the way that told her he had decided in advance how much he was going to say in this first meeting and was holding to that decision. "He was the reason you're here," he said finally. "He spent 40 years making sure you'd be all right. He just couldn't do it in person." Margaret's hand came down flat on the desk. Not a dramatic gesture. Not something she decided to do. Her hand simply came down and rested there, palm flat, against the wood, the way you put your hand down when the room has shifted and you need to feel something solid. Whitmore watched this and said nothing. The envelope sat between them. Margaret looked at it. Her name on the front in that uneven typeface, patient and waiting. She didn't pick it up. "I need to think," she said. "Of course. Can I take that with me?" "It's yours," Whitmore said. "It's always been yours." She drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat unopened, like something she wasn't sure she had the right to touch yet. The 3 hours back through New Hampshire and into Vermont, she kept her eyes on the road and her hands on the wheel and did not turn on the radio. The envelope sat in her peripheral vision the entire way, slightly tilted against the seat back where she had propped it, her name facing up. Margaret Cole. She had been Margaret Cole for 42 years. She had been a daughter and a sister and a wife and a mother and a teacher and a neighbor and 100 ordinary things, and she had never once had reason to wonder if any of it was built on something she didn't know about. Thomas Hale. She said the name once quietly to the empty car. It meant nothing to her, which was she was beginning to understand the whole problem. She put the kettle on twice before she heard his key in the door. The first time she filled it, set it on the burner, watched it until the steam started, then turned it off and poured the water out. The second time she didn't even watch it. She stood at the counter with her back to the stove and looked at the envelope on the kitchen table and listened to the water heat up behind her. The envelope had been there for 2 hours. She hadn't moved it, hadn't moved around it, had simply come in, set it on the table in the space between the fruit bowl and the salt shaker, and then proceeded to do every other thing in the kitchen that didn't involve touching it. Washed 2 dishes that were already clean, wiped the counter twice, put the kettle on, poured it out, put it on again. Her hands needed something to do. Her hands just couldn't find the right thing. Daniel came in at 4:15, the same time he always came in, backpack, over one shoulder, shoes untied, the way she had given up mentioning 2 years ago. He dropped the backpack by the door, she had also given up on that, and came into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. He took out an apple. He looked at her face. He didn't say anything yet. This was one of the things about Daniel that she had never quite figured out how to account for, the way he could read a room without appearing to read it, the way he absorbed the temperature of a situation and adjusted without making a production of adjusting. He was 15. He wasn't supposed to be good at this yet. Most 15-year-olds she had taught in 20 years of elementary school had the emotional subtlety of a car alarm. Daniel had learned somewhere, she suspected from watching her, that sometimes the most useful thing you could do was sit down and wait. He sat down across from her, took a bite of the apple, set it on the table, looked at the envelope, then at her, then back at the envelope with the particular neutrality of someone who has noticed something and decided not to mention that he's noticed it. They sat like that for a moment. Grandma kept a secret, Margaret said. A big one. Daniel looked at her. About you. About me. He nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded when he was filing something away rather than responding to it. His eyes went to the envelope again. Is that it? Part of it? Are you going to open it? I don't know yet. He picked up the apple, took another bite, chewed. She watched him think. She had always been able to watch him think. It was one of her favorite things about him, the way his face went quiet and interior when he was working something out. Does Uncle Richard know? He asked. The question was precise. She had raised him to ask precise questions. I think so, she said. Yes. But he didn't tell you. No. Daniel set the apple down. The half he hadn't eaten yet faced up, the white flesh already starting to brown at the edges. He looked at it for a second. Then he stood up, carried his chair around to her side of the table and sat back down beside her. Not across. Beside. He didn't say anything. Didn't put his arm around her or offer anything that would have required her to hold herself together more than she already was. Just moved to her side of the table and sat there close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, this boy she had raised alone in a series of apartments that were never quite big enough who untied his shoes and left his backpack by the door, and was in this moment the steadiest thing in the room. She didn't say anything either. Outside, the light was going. The kitchen lamp cast its usual yellow circle across the table, across the fruit bowl, across the envelope with her name typed on the front. Margaret Cole. 42 years she'd had that name. 42 years it had meant exactly one thing. She wasn't sure what it meant now. The envelope sat between them on the table, and neither of them reached for it, and that was somehow enough for now. She opened it, the way you open something you're not sure you can close again, slowly with both hands. Daniel had left at 7:15. She had made his lunch same as every morning, turkey and Swiss, the crusts cut off, because he was 15 and still didn't like crusts, and she had decided years ago that was not a battle worth having. She had heard the door close behind him, had stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening to the particular silence of a house after a teenager leaves it. Then she sat down at the table. No coffee first, no kettle. She pulled the envelope toward her, put both palms flat on the table on either side of it, and looked out the window at the backyard for a moment. The neighbor's maple was starting to turn. October coming early this year. She looked back at the envelope. Then she opened it. Inside, 3 things. A letter handwritten 4 pages. The paper cream-colored and heavy, the kind of paper you bought when what you were writing mattered. The handwriting was careful and slightly formal, the handwriting of someone who had composed this many times before, committing it to paper. A stack of photographs held together with a rubber band. She counted without meaning to. 31 photographs. And a second key, smaller than the first, attached to a paper tag with a room number written on it. Room 4, that was all. She set the keys together on the table, picked up the photographs, looked at the top one, and set the whole stack face down without going further. Not yet. She wasn't ready for those yet. She picked up the letter. Dear Margaret, if you're reading this, then you found the key, and you found Edward, and you've already been told the part I was never able to tell you myself. I want to tell you the rest of it in my own words, if you'll allow me that. Your mother's name was Claire Solon. She was 22 years old. She died 11 hours after you were born from a complication the doctors said was rare, and then said nothing further about, because there was nothing further to say. She had no family. Her parents had died when she was a teenager. She had no siblings, and the 2 of us were not married. We had known each other 8 months, which felt like enough at the time, and which I have thought about every day since. I was 24 years old. The court appointed a social worker. The social worker wrote a report. The report concluded that a 24-year-old man with no family support and no established household was not a suitable sole guardian for an infant. I was given 30 days to find an alternative arrangement or surrender parental rights. I want you to understand that I looked. I want you to understand that 30 days is not very long. Margaret stopped reading. She put the letter down on the table, face up, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Not because she needed to stop, because she needed to stay steady enough to keep going. She picked it back up. The Coles were recommended by the social worker as an approved foster family with a strong record. They had a son, Richard, who was 3. They had a house. They had what the court considered stability. I met them once in a conference room at the county office, and I signed the papers, and the social worker took you home with them that afternoon. I drove to the parking lot of a supermarket afterward and sat there for 2 hours. I don't know why I'm telling you that. I suppose I want you to know that I didn't go home and have dinner. The law said I had no further rights regarding your welfare. The law did not say I had to stop paying attention. She read that line again. The law did not say I had to stop paying attention. She put the letter down and picked up the photographs. The first one, a little girl maybe 4 years old in a backyard, Margaret didn't recognize running towards something outside the frame. The photograph was taken from a distance, slightly blurred, the kind of shot you got when you were too far away and had to zoom. She put it down. She picked up the next one. A school photograph, the kind taken every fall, the ones with the mottled blue background. Margaret was missing a front tooth. 6 years old, maybe 7. The photograph looked like it had been clipped from something, the edges slightly uneven. She put it down. She picked up the next one. He had never missed a single year. She went through them slowly after that, each one in order, setting each one face up on the table in a line from left to right, building a chronology she had never known existed. Her first day of high school, she recognized the sweater green with white stripes. She had worn it until it fell apart. Her college graduation taken from the back of the crowd, her cap slightly crooked. Her wedding day outside the church, laughing at something she remembered that moment. Remembered what Daniel's father had said to make her laugh, and the thought that this man had been standing somewhere nearby with a camera was something she could not yet fully hold. Daniel's birth announcement clipped from the local paper. Her first year teaching, a photo from the Hartwell Gazette's Back to School feature. 31 photographs. 42 years. In the last photograph, she was standing in front of her school on the first day of the semester, laughing at something a student had said. She hadn't known anyone was watching. She never did. She was still sitting there when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Richard. She looked at the photographs laid out across the table, in a line, 31 years of a life recorded by someone who was never permitted to be part of it, and she let the phone ring. The phone rang before the coffee finished brewing, and she already knew who it was before she looked. She had made the coffee after she put the photographs back in the envelope. Not all the way back, she couldn't make herself put them fully away, so she had stacked them neatly and set them beside the envelope rather than inside it, and then she had stood up and filled the kettle properly this time with the intention of actually using it. The phone rang at 8:47. Richard. She picked it up. Did you go to New Hampshire? Not how are you doing, or I saw you called yesterday, or anything that acknowledged the 3 days since their mother's funeral, with the ordinary texture of a brother checking in. Just that. Direct. Confirmed rather than asked. Yes, Margaret said. You went to see Whitmore. You know who he is. A pause. Shorter than the one in her mother's kitchen, but the same quality, a man choosing his next words with care. Mom told me about him years ago, Richard said. She told me there was a lawyer that he might try to contact you someday. She said if he did, it was best not to engage. She said that. She was trying to protect you, Margaret. Margaret looked at the photographs on the table. She didn't say anything. Thomas Hale was not a stable person. Richard's voice had found its footing now. The reasonable voice, the older brother voice, the voice he used when he had decided he was right about something. He had problems. Financial problems, personal problems. He signed away his rights because he knew he couldn't provide for you. Mom always said that. She said he made the right decision and then spent the rest of his life pretending it was someone else's fault. Is that what she said? That's what she knew. She did her research, Margaret. She wasn't going to bring someone like that into your life without knowing who he was. When did she do this research? I don't know. Years ago, early on. And she decided based on this research that I didn't need to know I was adopted. You weren't. He stopped. Started again. The Coles are your family. I am your family. That was never a lie. No, Margaret said. It wasn't. She meant it. That was the complicated part. She meant it completely, and it didn't change anything. He left me money, she said. Did you know that silence? How much? Richard said. His voice had shifted slightly. Something underneath the reasonable tone that she recognized and didn't want to name. Enough that it doesn't matter how much, Margaret said. Another silence. Different from the first ones. Margaret. His voice had softened, which was somehow worse than the controlled version. I know this is a lot. I know it feels like we kept something from you. But everything Mom and Dad did, everything I've done, it was to keep our family together. You have to understand that. We were afraid of losing you. She looked at the photographs. 31 of them stacked beside the envelope. A man standing at the correct legal distance for 42 years, building something worth $134 million, leaving every cent of it to a daughter he wasn't allowed to name. Two kinds of love. Both of them imperfect. Both of them real. Richard, she said, I want to ask you something. Of course, did she ever ask about me? A pause. Who my mother, Margaret said. My real mother. The silence this time was different from all the other silences. It was the silence of someone who hadn't expected the conversation to go this direction and didn't have a prepared answer waiting. Margaret, we are your real family. That's not what I asked. She waited. He didn't answer. Not because he was choosing his words, she understood, listening to the quality of the silence, that he didn't have words to choose from. He didn't know. He had never thought to find out. In 42 years of knowing Margaret was adopted, of knowing there was a woman who had given birth to her and died doing it, Richard had never once looked into who that woman was. Neither had their mother. They had been so focused on keeping Margaret close that they had never thought to look at what she might have needed to know. Her name was Claire, Margaret said. She was 22. She died 11 hours after I was born. Richard said nothing. Thomas Hale told me that. In a letter. She paused. Did you know her name? No, Richard said. His voice was quiet now. The reasonable tone was gone. What was left was just her brother, 50 years old, realizing something he couldn't unrealize. I didn't know her name. Okay, Margaret said. She set the phone down on the table without ending the call. Not to be cruel, she simply didn't have anything left to say, and she didn't want to make the gesture of hanging up, which felt like a door closing. She left it open. If he had something to say, she was willing to hear it. She went to look at the photographs again. Behind her from the phone on the table, she could hear him breathing, not saying anything, just breathing. She picked up the photograph from her first day of high school, the green sweater, the new backpack, the particular expression of a 15-year-old trying to look like she wasn't nervous. Somewhere behind the camera, a man she had never met had watched her walk through those doors. He had known her mother's name. He had always known. She left the phone on the table, with the call still connected, and went to look at the photographs again, and somewhere in the background, she could hear him breathing. Not saying anything, just breathing. The mailbox still had his name on it, black letters on white metal, and she stood in front of it for a long moment before she reached for the gate. Daniel stood beside her, hands in his jacket pockets, not saying anything. He had asked to come on the drive up, not with an explanation. Just, can I come? And she had said yes without asking why, and they had driven the 3 hours mostly in silence, the kind of silence that had become their language for things too large for conversation. The house was at the end of a gravel road outside Colebrook, set back from the tree line, with a cleared yard on 3 sides. 2 stories, wood frame, white paint weathered to the color of old cream. A covered porch across the front. The garden along the left side was still tended. Someone had been here recently, the beds turned over, the late-season plants cut back with care. Thomas Hale, the mailbox said. She had been saying his name for 4 days now, quietly in the car, in the kitchen, in the space between sleeping and waking. It still didn't feel like a name that belonged to her life. She opened the gate. Whitmore had left a key to the front door with his receptionist, along with a note that said simply, "Take whatever time you need. The house is yours." Margaret had read the note twice in the parking lot, before folding it into her coat pocket, alongside the brass key and the smaller key with room 4 on the tag. The front door opened into a hallway. Hardwood floors, the boards slightly uneven in the way of old houses, the kind that announced every step. The sound of her footfall in the empty house was louder than she expected, a sound that said, "No one has walked here in some time," and she found herself stepping more carefully, as if not wanting to disturb something. The cold came next. The particular cold of a house that had been closed up through the transition from summer to fall, the warmth gone out of the walls, the air still and slightly sweet, with the smell of old paper and pine from the wood stove in the corner of the living room. She stood in the doorway of the living room and let her eyes move through it slowly. Books on every wall. Floor to ceiling on 2 sides, the shelves built into the house rather than standing against it, the kind of shelves a man builds when he intends to stay. She moved closer and looked at the spines. History mostly, and architecture, and 3 full shelves of natural science birds and trees, and the geology of New England. Every book she pulled an inch off the shelf had notes in the margins. Small, precise handwriting in pencil, questions and observations, and the occasional single underlined word with nothing written beside it, as if the word itself was enough. The kitchen was small and clean. A single mug on the drying rack. A dish towel folded over the oven handle with geometric precision. In the living room beside the window that looked out over the garden, there was a reading chair. Dark green fabric wooden arms, the cushion shaped by years of use. The right armrest was worn smooth where a hand had rested the wood beneath the fabric, visible at the edge polished by years of contact. A reading lamp beside it angled just so. She stood and looked at that chair for a moment. A man had sat in that chair for a very long time. She was still looking at it when Daniel said quietly from across the room, "Mom." He was standing in front of the far wall. She crossed the room and stood beside him. On the wall between the 2 bookshelves was a map. New England printed large, the kind sold in gas stations and folded wrong, so they never folded right again. This one had been mounted on a piece of backing board and pinned flat, the corners precise. Someone had spent time on this. Vermont was in the upper left quadrant. The map was detailed enough to show county roads, small towns, the kind of places that didn't make it onto highway maps. One town was circled in red pen, Hartwell, Vermont, where Margaret had taught for 17 years, where Daniel had grown up, where she had bought her first house at 38, a small cape with a leaking roof that she had fixed herself over 2 summers. The circle was not recent. The ink had faded to the color of rust, the kind of fading that took years. Daniel looked at the map. Then he stepped back 1 step and turned slightly away, and she understood that he was giving her the moment rather than standing inside it with her. 15 years old, giving her the moment. She looked at the circle for a long time. He hadn't just known she existed. He had known exactly where she was. Not in a way that crossed any line she thought about, that standing there, and she believed it because everything she had learned about Thomas Hale so far was of a man who understood precisely where the lines were and chose to stand just behind them. He had known where she was, and he had stayed away. That was its own kind of thing. They found the staircase at the back of the hallway. The stairs were narrow, the railing smooth under her hand. At the top, a short hallway with 2 doors, one open showing a bedroom, spare and clean. One closed. No handle. Only a lock set into the door at the standard height, a small brass plate around the keyhole worn to a shine. She took the second key from her pocket. The one with room 4 on the tag, though there were only 2 rooms up here, and she had stopped trying to make it make sense. She put her hand flat against the door. Behind her, 1 step back, Daniel said, "Mom." 1 word. Not a question. Not pressure. Just, "I'm here." She put the key in the lock and Daniel said, "Mom," just once, quietly, and she turned it. The room was small, and it was full of her. Margaret stood in the doorway and didn't step in. The door had opened on a room maybe 10 feet by 12, a single window on the far wall, letting in the flat afternoon light of an October overcast. A desk, a bookshelf, a wooden chair tucked under the desk, with the precision of someone who always put things back exactly where they belonged. And on the walls, every wall, floor to ceiling, covering the pale yellow paint, entirely her. Not the photographs from the envelope. Those had been taken from a distance, blurred with zoom and caution. The photographs of a man who understood he had no right to be close. These were different. Newspaper clippings, dozens of them pinned with small brass tacks in neat rows. Photocopies of documents she stepped close enough to see and recognized the format of a teaching award, the school district's letterhead, at the top, her name in the center. Thank you letters, the handwritten kind that parents sometimes sent at the end of the year, the ones she kept in a folder in her desk at school because she read them when the job was hard. She had never wondered how copies of those letters could exist outside that folder. A photograph from the Hartwell Gazette. 2019, the year she'd been named the county's elementary educator of the year. She remembered the photographer, a young man who had seemed nervous, who had asked her to stand in front of the whiteboard. She was smiling in the photograph, slightly awkward, the way she always was in photographs, her hand raised as if she'd been mid-sentence when the shutter clicked. Thomas Hale had pinned it at eye level in the center of the wall above the desk. Daniel came to stand beside her in the doorway. She heard him exhale not a word, just breath, and then he was quiet again. He knew everything Margaret said. Daniel didn't answer. He was looking at the walls the same way she was, slowly pawning his eyes across it, the way you read something important. She stepped into the room. The desk held 3 things, a lamp, a cup of pens, and a notebook. Thick cloth covered the fabric worn at the corners. No label on the outside. She sat down in the chair. It fit the way chairs fit when they've been shaped by a particular body over years, and opened it. The first entry was dated March 14th, 1982. Margaret Cole, age 2. Enrolled at Hartwell Early Learning Center, 44 Birch Street. Teachers, Mrs. Alvarez, lead Miss Donnelly, aide. Facility rating excellent. District inspection record clean. That was all. No feeling, no commentary. Just facts recorded in the careful handwriting she recognized now, from the letter, from the envelope, from the tag on the second key. She turned pages. September 1985. Margaret Cole, age 5. Enrolled Hartwell Elementary Kindergarten. Class size 22. Teacher assignment, Mrs. Flood. Reputation strong. Structured but warm. Good. June 1989. Margaret Cole, age 9. End-of-year report card. All satisfactory or above. Reading level advanced. Math grade level. Note, she stays after class sometimes to help put chairs up. The teacher mentioned it to Richard at pickup. Richard told their mother. Their mother told no one else. Margaret stopped. She read that last line again. Their mother told no one else. He had known that. He had known the small, unremarkable details of her days, not from proximity, but from the kind of patient, careful attention that found information in the gaps between official records. She didn't know how. She wasn't sure she needed to know how. She kept reading. The entries continued through middle school, through high school, through her years at the University of Vermont. They were thorough and dry and informational, the language of a man who had decided to document rather than feel, and then scattered through them lines that didn't belong to that project at all. October 1993. She laughed today at something her roommate said. I could tell from the photograph. She has her mother's laugh. I don't know how else to describe it. Claire used to laugh the same way with her whole face. Margaret put her hand flat on the page. She had not known her mother's name until 4 days ago. Thomas Hale had been carrying it for 42 years. She turned more pages. May 2003. She looks tired in the photographs this month. I hope someone is taking care of her. A pause in the entries, several blank lines. Then I think she is taking care of herself. She always has. November 2008. Daniel Patrick Cole, born October 31st. She looks exhausted and completely certain which is exactly right. September 2019. The County Award. I watched the ceremony from the parking lot. I stayed in the car. I want to be clear about that I did not go inside. I heard the applause when her name was called. That was enough. That was more than enough. Daniel was reading over her shoulder. She could feel him there, not leaning in, just present, reading at the same pace she was, his breath steady. She turned to the last page. The handwriting here was slightly different, slower, the letters more deliberate. The hand of a man who was tired or unwell or both. The date was 3 weeks before Whitmore had told her Thomas Hale died. I don't know if she'll come. I don't know if she'll want to. The lawyer has his instructions and the house is ready, and I have done everything I can think to do from here. Everything in this house is hers now, not because I owe her, not because I'm trying to buy something I forfeited 42 years ago, but because I spent 42 years watching her become someone I'm proud of. She is a good teacher. She is a good mother. She kept her word to people when keeping it was hard, and she did it quietly without asking anyone to notice. I noticed. I just never got to tell her that. Margaret sat with that for a long time. The afternoon light through the window had shifted, while she'd been reading, moving across the desk, in the way light moved through west-facing windows in October, slower than you expected, then gone. She was crying. She became aware of it the way you become aware of rain gradually, then all at once. Not the kind of crying that needed to be managed or explained. Just tears moving down her face while she sat in a dead man's chair in a room wallpapered with the evidence of her own life, holding a notebook in which someone had written down in careful pencil 42 years of paying attention. He had never asked her for anything. He had never asked her to come. He had only left the door and the key and hoped. Behind her, she heard Daniel close the notebook. She hadn't realized she'd set it down. She turned to look at him. He closed it carefully, the way you close something that belongs to someone else, and set it back exactly where it had been on the desk spine, aligned with the edge precisely as they'd found it. Then he looked at her. He didn't say, "Are you okay?" or "What do we do now?" or any of the things that would have required her to have an answer. He just looked at her, this 15-year-old boy who had driven 3 hours in silence and stood in a doorway and given her the moment with the map, and now this, and she understood, looking at him, that whatever came next, she was not going to do it alone. Whitmore came at 4 o'clock, the way people come when they've been waiting for the right moment and have decided this is it. Margaret heard the car on the gravel and looked out the kitchen window and saw his gray sedan pulling up beside her own. She had come downstairs 20 minutes earlier, after sitting in Thomas Hale's chair long enough that the light in the room had changed. Daniel had made tea in the kitchen. She didn't know how he'd found the tea, but he had, and there were 2 mugs on the table when she came down, and he hadn't said anything about her eyes. She let Whitmore in. He came through the front door with a manila envelope under his arm, smaller than the first one, thicker than it looked, and he stood in the hallway for a moment. taking in the house the way a person does when they haven't been somewhere in a while and are checking whether it's the same as they remembered. "I used to come out here," he said. "When Thomas was alive. We'd have dinner once a month the last Thursday. He cooked well. Better than you'd expect from a man who ate alone most of the time." Margaret looked at him. "You were his friend," she said. "I was his lawyer for 31 years. A pause. "Yes, I was his friend." He sat down at the kitchen table across from Daniel, who slid one of the mugs toward him without being asked. Whitmore accepted it with a nod, the nod of a man acknowledging something that didn't need to be said, and set the envelope on the table between them. "This is the last one," he said. "He said it was to be given to you after you'd been in the room, not before." "Why after?" "Because what's in it will make more sense after." He looked at her steadily. "And because he wanted you to know who he was before you knew everything else." He didn't open the envelope for her. He set it on the table and folded his hands and told her what was in it first, which she understood was its own kind of care, giving her the information before she had to hold the paper. "When you were 19, Whitmore said Thomas wrote you a letter." Margaret was quiet. "You were in your first year at the University of Vermont. He'd been watching from a distance for 19 years by then. And he told me he'd been deciding for years, actually going back and forth, that you were old enough to choose. That you had the right to know he existed, and the right to decide what to do with that. He wrote the letter and he sent it to your family's address in Hartwell." "I never got a letter," Margaret said. "No," Whitmore said. "You didn't." The kitchen was very still. "Your mother received it. Your foster mother." He said it carefully, not unkindly. "She kept it. She didn't destroy it. I want you to know that because I think it matters. She kept it in that locked drawer with your name on the envelope, and she never gave it to you, and she never told you it existed." Margaret thought about the drawer. The locked drawer she had opened with a screwdriver 3 days ago. The shoebox inside. The envelope with her name in handwriting she didn't recognize. That was his handwriting, she said. On the envelope she kept. Yes. She sat with that. She had been 19 years old once. She remembered that year with the particular clarity of a year when everything was new and slightly frightening, and full of the sense that her life was beginning. She had started at UVM in September, declared an education major by October, called home every Sunday without fail. She remembered a feeling that year she hadn't thought about it in decades, a feeling she had never been able to name exactly. Not loneliness, not unhappiness, something more like incompleteness, like a word she knew existed but couldn't remember. A letter had been sitting in a locked drawer in Hartwell, Vermont that entire year. Thomas waited 6 months for a response, Whitmore continued. When none came, he concluded you'd received the letter and chosen not to reply. He respected that. He believed he told me this directly more than once, that you had every right not to want to know him. That he had forfeited that when he signed the papers. He never tried a second time. He thought I didn't want him. Yes. For 42 years, he thought I didn't want him. He honored what he believed was your choice, Whitmore said. That was the kind of man he was. Margaret looked at the window. Outside the garden, Thomas Hale had planted, and a neighbor had tended, and that now belonged to her was going brown at the edges, in the way of October gardens, giving back to the ground what the ground had lent it for the summer. 2 people. 42 years. Both of them honoring a silence that had been created by a third person who was only trying to hold her family together and had been too afraid to ask if that was what Margaret wanted. Your brother didn't know, Whitmore said. He said it simply, without emphasis, in the same neutral voice he had used for everything else, but she heard what was underneath it. The word alone. Their mother had made this decision alone, had carried it, alone had died with it still in the locked drawer, like something she couldn't bring herself to throw away or give back. Your mother made that decision alone. Margaret looked at Daniel. He was watching her with the careful attention he'd had all day, all week. The attention of someone who understood that what was happening was large and was choosing to be steady inside it, rather than react to its surface. She thought about her mother, not the woman who had kept the letter. She couldn't go there yet, not fully, but the woman who had folded dish towels with geometric precision and sat beside her when she was sick and driven 4 hours each way to see her graduate, and never once, not once, made her feel like anything other than a daughter. Both things were true. She was going to have to learn to hold both things. Whitmore stood. He picked up his coat from the back of the chair and looked at the envelope still on the table. That's the full accounting, he said. The estate details, the property transfer documents, the financial summary. $134 million in various holdings. It's all straightforward. He spent 30 years making sure it would be straightforward for you. He moved toward the door, then stopped. He talked about you, Whitmore said. At our dinners. Not often he wasn't a man who talked about things he couldn't do anything about. But sometimes, he'd mention something he'd read in the Hartwell paper or something he'd heard about the school. He was always... He paused, choosing the word carefully. Satisfied. That's the word. Every time he mentioned you, he looked satisfied, like a man watching something come out right. He went outside to wait, and Margaret looked at the envelope, and Daniel looked at his mother, and the house was very quiet. She didn't open the envelope right away. She sat at Thomas Hale's kitchen table in Thomas Hale's house with Daniel beside her, and the October light going thin through the windows, and she let herself feel the specific weight of what she now knew. Her foster mother had been afraid. Richard had been afraid. Thomas Hale had been afraid of crossing a line he believed she had drawn. Everyone in this story had been trying to protect something, and the protecting had cost 42 years of silence, and no one was left to apologize for it, except the living who had only ever known half the story. She reached across the table and put her hand over Daniel's. He turned his hand over and held hers back. Outside, she could hear Whitmore on the porch, the quiet shift of his weight, the patience of a man who had been waiting a long time and had gotten good at it. She picked up the envelope. Richard drove up on a Saturday morning, 3 days after Whitmore left. She had called him, not a long call, just, I think you should come. There are things I want to say in person. He had been quiet for a moment, then said he'd be there by 10. He arrived at 9:55, which was the most Richard thing he could have done. She watched him get out of the car from the kitchen window. He stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the house the way she had stood at the mailbox, she realized. Taking it in. Trying to find a way to enter something he hadn't been invited into before. She went to the door and opened it before he knocked. They sat at the kitchen table. She had made coffee. Real coffee this time in Thomas Hale's percolator, which she had figured out on the second morning. Richard wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at it rather than at her, and she let him have that. I didn't know about the letter, he said. I need you to know that. I know, Margaret said. Whitmore told me. Mom never, He stopped. Started again. She never told me she'd kept anything. I thought she'd just decided not to engage, that Thomas had never actually reached out. She was afraid, Margaret said. Yeah. He looked up. His face was tired in a way that was different from ordinary tiredness, the face of someone who had been revising something in their head for 3 days and hadn't finished. I've been thinking about that. She was afraid the whole time. I think she loved you so much. It made her do something she knew wasn't right. and she spent 30 years not being able to undo it. Margaret looked at him across Thomas Hale's table. "I know," she said again. "Are you—" He stopped himself, tried a different way in. "I don't know how to ask if you're okay, because I don't know what okay looks like from here." "I don't either," Margaret said. "Not yet." That was honest, and he knew it was honest, and something in his face shifted, not relief exactly, but the specific relaxation of a man who had been braced for something worse and found that the worst hadn't come yet and might not. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. "The house, the money." She'd been thinking about this since Whitmore drove away, since she'd sat at this table with Daniel and held the weight of $134 million in a manila envelope, and understood that the number was the least important thing in it. "I'm going to keep the house," she said. "I don't know what I'll do with the rest yet. Something that means something." Thomas spent 42 years building it quietly without telling anyone, "I don't want to do something loud with it." She paused. "Something that helps people who don't have someone paying attention to them." Richard was quiet for a moment. "He really watched over you," he said. Not a question. He really did. All that time. All that time. Richard looked at his coffee. Outside, the garden was still and gold in the late October light, the way gardens went in the last weeks, before the first frost, everything giving its best color just before it let go. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what we kept from you, for what Mom kept, for the parts I knew and didn't question, because it was easier not to." Margaret looked at her brother, 50 years old, tired, sitting in the kitchen of a man he had never met, trying to find a way to stay her brother through something that had changed what that meant. She wasn't going to tell him it was fine. It wasn't fine. It was complicated and real and would take longer than a Saturday morning to become anything she could name. But she also wasn't going to close the door. "I know you were afraid of losing me," she said. "I understand that. I'm not there yet with the rest of it, but I understand that part." He nodded once. The nod of someone receiving something carefully, not taking more than was offered. They sat with that for a while. The percolator ticked as it cooled. Somewhere in the yard, a bird Margaret didn't recognize called once and went quiet. Richard left at noon. He hugged her at the door, a careful hug, the kind that asked a question rather than assumed an answer, and she let him hold on for a moment before she stepped back. "Call me," he said. "I will," she said. She watched his car go back down the gravel road and stood in the doorway until the sound of the engine faded into the trees. Then she went inside and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the house. Daniel was upstairs. She could hear the particular quiet of him being somewhere nearby, not making noise, just present the way he had been all week. She went up the stairs, not to Thomas Hale's room, past it to the small room at the end of the hall. She went in and stood in the middle of the room, looking at the walls, at her own life, arranged in careful rows around her, the newspaper clippings and the teaching awards, and the photograph from 2019 pinned at eye level above the desk. She had thought she might want to take it all down. She understood now that she didn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. This was what 42 years of attention looked like. She walked to the window. It was the only window in the room, a single sash looking out over the back of the property, a field, and beyond the field the tree line, and beyond that the mountains going blue in the October distance. Thomas Hale had looked at this view from this room, probably from this window, for all the years he had been building this life she was only now inheriting. She put her hand on the latch. It took a small amount of force. The window had been closed for months. The wood swollen slightly with autumn damp, and then it gave and the window swung open and the air came in. Cold and smelling of pine and turned earth, and the particular cleanness of a place that had not been breathed in for a long time. She stood in it for a moment. Then quietly, to no one, to the field and the trees and the mountains and the October air, she said the name out loud for the first time. Claire Solon. Her mother's name. 22 years old. No family left. Gone 11 hours after Margaret arrived. She had not known that name for 42 years. Thomas Hale had carried it every one of those years, had written it down in a letter, so Margaret would have. It had made sure it would not disappear entirely from the world, just because the woman who bore it had. Margaret said it again, slightly louder. Claire Solon. Not for Richard. Not for Daniel. Not for Thomas, who had already known it better than anyone. For herself. Because she was 42 years old, and she was standing in a room full of her own life. And outside the window, the mountains were doing what mountains did, existing, patient, permanent, entirely indifferent to the size of any individual moment. And she had a mother's name now, and she was going to keep it. The cold air moved through the room, lifting the edges of the newspaper clippings on the wall, and Margaret stood at the open window and let it. Has there ever been someone in your life who watched over you from a distance, and you only found out later? Tell us in the comments.